You're faking it for attention, just like you always do, my brother Austin said, rolling his eyes as I struggled to lift a grocery bag from my car. There's nothing wrong with you that a little tough love won't fix. My name is Cameron Reed, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever served your country in combat, came home broken in ways people can't see, only to have your own family accuse you of making it all up for sympathy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. Because that's exactly what happened to me, and what I discovered hidden in my medical files 6 months later didn't just leave my brother speechless, it changed everything I thought I knew about my own injuries and the family who was supposed to support me through them. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I need you to understand something from the start. This isn't just a story about invisible wounds or family betrayal. This is about how some people would rather believe their loved one is a liar than accept that war leaves scars that can't be seen from the outside. And it's about how one set of x-rays, images that had been sitting in my medical file for 2 years, proved that everything I'd been saying about my pain was not only real, but far worse than anyone had imagined. But let me take you back to the beginning, because the seeds of this confrontation were planted long before that grocery store parking lot in Riverside Falls, long before Austin's cruel words, long before I discovered the shrapnel that military doctors had somehow missed for over 3 years. I enlisted in the Army at 19, straight out of Riverside Falls High School, much to my family's dismay. My parents, Robert and Linda Reed, had expected me to follow Austin's path. College, business degree, comfortable job in our small Colorado town where nothing ever happened and nothing ever changed. Austin was the golden child, 3 years older, valedictorian, full scholarship to Denver University, and everything my parents wanted in a child. He was predictable, successful, and, most importantly, safe. I was none of those things. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I announced my intention to join the military, the family dinner conversation went exactly as you'd expect. "Cameron, be realistic," Dad had said, cutting his pot roast with surgical precision. "The military is for people who don't have other options. You have options." "What if I want to serve my country?" I'd asked. Austin had laughed. Actually laughed, like the idea was absurd. Serve your country, Cam? You can barely serve yourself breakfast without burning something. They saw my enlistment as a phase, a rebellious detour that would eventually lead me back to their safe, predictable vision of my future. They had no idea that I was looking for something they couldn't give me. Purpose, challenge, and the chance to prove that I was capable of more than they'd ever expected. Basic training at Fort Benning was brutal, but transformative. For the first time in my life, I wasn't Austin Reed's little sister or Robert and Linda's disappointment. I was Private Reed, and my worth was measured by my performance, not my family's expectations. I excelled. Physical fitness, marksmanship, tactical training, everything clicked in ways that college prep courses never had. I found my calling in military intelligence, and after advanced training, I was assigned to the 525th Battlefield Surveillance Brigade. My first deployment was to Afghanistan, and I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. This was what I'd trained for, what I'd dreamed about during those long nights at Fort Benning when my body ached and my drill sergeant was screaming, and I wondered if I'd made a huge mistake. The forward operating base in Kandahar province was everything and nothing like I'd expected. The heat was overwhelming, the dust got into everything, and the constant threat of attack created a tension that never fully left your shoulders. But the work was important, meaningful in ways I'd never experienced. As an intelligence analyst, I spent most of my time in the operations center, processing surveillance data, identifying threats, and coordinating with field units. It wasn't the frontline combat that movies show, but it was crucial work that kept soldiers alive. I was good at it, really good. Within 6 months, I was handling high-priority intelligence briefings and earning commendations from officers who had been doing this work for decades. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The letters from home were sporadic and lukewarm. Mom would write about the weather and local gossip, carefully avoiding any mention of missing me or being proud of my service. Dad's occasional emails were brief updates about his accounting practice, with the underlying message that my adventure would eventually end and real life would resume. Austin's communications were the worst. When he bothered to respond to my emails at all, they were filled with barely concealed condescension about my playing soldier while he was building a career in Denver's financial sector. But I didn't need their approval anymore. I had found my tribe in the men and women I served with, people who understood that some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth the risk. That understanding was tested on March 15th, 2019, during my second deployment. I was working a night shift in the operations center when the attack began. Mortars first, then rocket-propelled grenades, then small arms fire that seemed to come from every direction. The base's defensive systems activated, sirens wailed, and everyone not essential to immediate operations was ordered to the bunkers. As an intelligence analyst, I was essential personnel. My job was to coordinate with field units, track the attack patterns, and help identify the source of the assaults so our forces could respond effectively. The operations center was supposed to be one of the safest places on base. Reinforced concrete, multiple redundant systems, and protected by layers of defensive positions. It was where the critical decisions got made, and it was designed to withstand exactly this kind of attack. But wars don't always follow the rules of engineering and planning. The mortar round that changed everything hit the building at 11:47 p.m. Not a direct hit, but close enough that the explosion sent a shockwave through the structure that knocked out power, shattered windows, and filled the air with debris and dust. I remember the moment of impact with perfect clarity, the way the world went white and then black, the sensation of being lifted and then slammed down, the taste of blood and dust in my mouth. What I don't remember clearly is the next several minutes. The period when medics pulled me from the rubble and began the process of determining whether I was going to live or die. According to the medical reports I would read much later, I'd suffered a severe concussion, multiple lacerations, and what they classified as minor shrapnel wounds from debris and fragments that had torn through the operations center. Minor. That word would haunt me for years. I woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, head pounding, vision blurry, and with a pain in my left side that felt like someone had driven a hot poker between my ribs and was slowly twisting it. "You're lucky," the doctor told me. "Concussion symptoms should clear up in a few weeks, and the cuts are mostly superficial. The shrapnel wounds are clean. We got all the major pieces out. You'll be sore for a while, but nothing that won't heal." Nothing that won't heal. Another phrase that would come back to haunt me. They kept me in the field hospital for a week, running basic neurological tests and monitoring for signs of serious brain injury. When my cognitive functions appeared normal and the worst of the concussion symptoms subsided, they cleared me for limited duty. But something wasn't right. The headaches came in waves that left me nauseous and dizzy. The pain in my side was constant, a deep ache that got worse with movement, worse with stress, worse with the kind of physical activity that had never bothered me before the attack. Most concerning were the episodes, sudden moments when the world would tilt, when sounds would become too loud, when bright lights would trigger what felt like electrical storms in my brain. The doctors called them post-concussion symptoms and assured me that they would fade with time. They didn't fade. If anything, they got worse. By the time my deployment ended 8 months later, I was struggling to function. Simple tasks that had once been automatic, processing intelligence reports, coordinating communications, even basic physical activities had become exhausting ordeals that left me drained and disoriented. But I'd learned to hide it. In a military culture that values toughness above almost everything else, admitting weakness felt like admitting failure. So I pushed through, compensated, and told myself that the doctors were right. It would get better with time. Coming home to Riverside Falls in December 2019 should have been a celebration. I was a decorated combat veteran with an honorable discharge and a chest full of commendations. I should have been proud, and my family should have been proud of me. Instead, I was a mess trying to pretend I wasn't falling apart, and they were a family trying to pretend my service had never happened. The homecoming dinner was awkward and tense. Mom had made my favorite meal, lasagna and garlic bread, but everything tasted like cardboard. The lights in the dining room seemed too bright, and the conversation felt like it was happening underwater. "So," Dad said, cutting his lasagna with the same surgical precision he'd always applied to everything,
I assume you'll be looking for work now that you're done with your military phase. Military phase. Like it had been a semester abroad instead of 4 years of service, including 2 combat deployments. I'm considering my options, I said, which was true. I was also considering how much longer I could sit at this table before the fluorescent light fixture above us triggered another one of my episodes. Austin's been doing really well at Morrison Financial. They're always looking for responsible people, and I'm sure he could put in a good word. Responsible people. The implication being that my military service had somehow been irresponsible? A detour from the path of respectability that Austin had stayed on? Austin himself had been quiet during most of the meal, but he chose that moment to speak up. You know, Cam, you might want to consider some kind of trade school or certification program, something practical. The whole soldier thing was fine for a few years, but now you need to think about real career development. The whole soldier thing? 4 years of my life, 2 deployments, a Purple Heart, and multiple commendations reduced to the whole soldier thing. I have plenty of real-world experience, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Intelligence analysis, strategic planning, crisis management. Sure, Austin interrupted, but that's all military stuff. I'm talking about skills that translate to the civilian world. That's when I felt the first wave of dizziness hit. The familiar sensation that preceded my worst episodes. The room started to tilt slightly, and the voices around me became distant and echoing. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face and waiting for the world to stop spinning. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized, pale, drawn, with dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. I was 26 years old and felt like I was falling apart from the inside out.
The months that followed established a pattern that would define my relationship with my family for the next 3 years. I struggled with symptoms that seemed to have no clear cause or cure, while they grew increasingly impatient with my inability to bounce back and resume a normal life. The headaches were the most debilitating. They would start as a dull pressure behind my eyes and build to migraines that left me bedridden for hours, sometimes days. Light became my enemy. Loud noises felt like physical assaults. Even conversations required energy I didn't have. The chronic pain was different, but equally exhausting. It centered in my left side, right below my ribs, and radiated outward like someone had planted a coal fire inside my torso. Some days it was manageable. Other days, simple movements like bending over or lifting a cup of coffee would trigger spasms that took my breath away. But the cognitive symptoms were the most frightening. The sharp mind that had made me an excellent intelligence analyst seemed to have been replaced by something cloudy and unreliable. I would lose words mid-sentence, forget appointments, struggle to follow complex conversations. Tasks that had once been automatic now required intense concentration and left me mentally exhausted. I went to doctor after doctor seeking answers and relief. The VA medical system was overwhelmed and understaffed, and my symptoms didn't fit neatly into any obvious category. Post-concussion syndrome, they said, chronic pain disorder, possible PTSD, anxiety and depression secondary to adjustment difficulties. The treatments they offered, medication for pain, therapy for the psychological symptoms, lifestyle modifications for the headaches, helped marginally but never addressed the core issues. I felt like I was fighting a war against my own body, and I was losing. My family's response was predictably unsympathetic. Everyone has headaches, Mom would say when I had to cancel dinner plans. You can't just hide in your apartment every time you don't feel perfect. Maybe you need to push yourself more, Dad suggested. Get back into a routine. Structure and discipline, that's what you need. But Austin was the worst. He had appointed himself the family expert on my situation, and his prescription was always the same. Stop making excuses and get on with your life.
"You're using these mystery symptoms as a crutch," he told me during a particularly brutal family gathering. "It's been over a year, Cam. At some point, you have to stop playing the victim and take responsibility for your own happiness." Mystery symptoms. That's what he called the pain that kept me awake at night, the headaches that made me vomit, the cognitive fog that had stolen my ability to think clearly. The breaking point came during my nephew Tyler's birthday party in March 2022. Austin's 8-year-old son was celebrating at one of those indoor play centers with flashing lights, arcade games, and the kind of sensory chaos that turned my brain into a war zone. I'd taken medication preemptively, worn sunglasses indoors like some kind of celebrity avoiding paparazzi, and positioned myself in the quietest corner I could find. But 30 minutes in, the familiar warning signs began. Visual disturbances, nausea, the sensation that someone was driving an ice pick through my skull. I found Austin and explained that I needed to leave. "Are you kidding me?" he said, loud enough that other parents turned to stare. "It's Tyler's birthday. You can't handle a kid's party for 2 hours?" "Austin, I'm not feeling well. The lights and noise." "The lights and noise?" he repeated mockingly. "Cameron, you're 28 years old. You served in Afghanistan. You're telling me you can't handle Chuck E. Cheese?" Other family members were watching now, and I could see the familiar expression on their faces, embarrassment mixed with frustration, the look that said I was once again being difficult and dramatic. "I have a medical condition," I said quietly. "This isn't a choice." That's when Austin delivered the line that would echo in my head for months. "You have a convenient excuse for everything. Headaches when you don't want to work, pain when you don't want to help move furniture, episodes when social situations get uncomfortable. Face it, Cam, you're faking it for attention, just like you always do." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Faking it. After everything I had been through, everything I was still going through, my own brother thought I was making it all up. I left the party without another word, drove home through a haze of pain and humiliation, and spent the next 2 days in bed with one of the worst migraines I'd ever experienced. But Austin's words had planted a seed of doubt that grew into something poisonous. What if he was right? What if I was subconsciously exaggerating my symptoms? What if the pain and cognitive issues were psychological rather than physical? The doubt ate at me for weeks. I started questioning every symptom, every moment of pain, every time I had to cancel plans or ask for help. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe I was using my military service as an excuse for personal weakness. I began pushing myself harder, ignoring the warning signs that usually preceded my worst episodes. If Austin thought I was faking it, I would prove him wrong by powering through everything. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Within a month, I was having episodes almost daily. The headaches became so severe that I ended up in the emergency room twice. The chronic pain flared to levels that made simple tasks like grocery shopping feel like running a marathon. But the worst part was the isolation. I stopped telling my family about my symptoms, stopped asking for help, stopped hoping for understanding. If they thought I was faking it, then I would suffer in silence rather than give them more ammunition. That's how I ended up in that grocery store parking lot 6 months later, struggling with a bag of groceries while my brother watched with contempt and made his cruel pronouncement about tough love. What none of us knew, what the military doctors had somehow missed, what 3 years of civilian medical treatment had failed to discover, was that there were still pieces of that mortar attack living inside my body.
Shrapnel fragments, microscopic pieces of metal and debris embedded so deep in my tissue that they hadn't shown up on the initial field assessments. Fragments that were slowly migrating, causing inflammation, pressing against nerves, creating the exact constellation of symptoms that had been ruining my life.
The discovery would come by accident, during a routine scan ordered by a new doctor who was more thorough than her predecessors. And when those x-rays came back showing a dozen metal fragments scattered through my torso and skull, everything would change. Not just my treatment, not just my prognosis, but my entire relationship with the family who had spent 3 years telling me that my pain was imaginary. Because it's one thing to accuse someone of faking symptoms for attention, it's another thing entirely to maintain that accusation when presented with X-ray images showing actual pieces of war embedded in their body. Austin's words had cut deep, but the shrapnel had cut deeper. And when the truth finally came to light, the silence that followed would be more deafening than any mortar explosion I'd ever experienced. The grocery store confrontation was just the beginning. The real battle, for my health, for my dignity, for my family's understanding, was about to begin. And this time, I would have something I'd never had before in this fight. Proof. Undeniable, X-ray evidence that every word I'd said about my pain was not only true, but had been an understatement of what I was actually enduring. The family who had accused me of faking my injuries was about to learn that the human body can carry the wounds of war for years without anyone noticing, and that sometimes the most devastating battles are the ones fought in complete silence. Austin thought he knew everything about my condition, about my character, about the legitimacy of my suffering. The shrapnel x-rays were about to teach him how wrong he'd been about all of it.
"Wow," she murmured, leaning closer to her monitor. "What is it?" I asked. "I need to call the radiologist," she said, her voice careful and professional. "There are some findings that need immediate review." My stomach dropped. In my experience, findings that need immediate review usually meant something terrible was wrong. 30 minutes later, Dr. Winters called my cell phone directly. "Cameron, I need you to come to my office immediately. Can you drive, or do you need someone to pick you up?" "I can drive." "What did you find?" "We'll discuss it when you get here. Just prepare yourself. This is going to change everything." The drive to Dr. Winters' office felt like it took forever. Every traffic light seemed to last an eternity. Every minute stretched like an hour. My mind raced through possibilities, most of them catastrophic. Dr. Winters was waiting for me when I arrived, and her expression was a mixture of vindication and concern that I couldn't quite read. "Cameron, sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I'm going to show you something, and I want you to be prepared for what you're about to see." She turned her computer monitor toward me and pulled up the scan results. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The images looked like a constellation of tiny white dots scattered throughout my torso and skull. Dozens of them, maybe more, each one a small, bright fragment against the gray background of my internal organs. These are metallic foreign objects. Shrapnel fragments that have been inside your body for over 3 years. They're everywhere, in your chest cavity, embedded in muscle tissue, one particularly large piece that's been pressing against a nerve cluster in your left side. I stared at the screen in shock. How is this possible? The field medic said they got everything out. Field medicine is about keeping people alive, not about finding every microscopic fragment. These pieces are small, some of them smaller than a grain of rice. They wouldn't have been visible on the basic X-rays they had available in combat conditions. She clicked to the next image, a close-up of my skull. This is the most concerning finding. You have multiple fragments near your brainstem, and this larger piece here has been creating pressure that explains your chronic headaches and neurological symptoms. My hands were shaking as the full impact hit me. Everything I'd been experiencing, every moment of pain, every cognitive struggle, every symptom that my family had dismissed as psychological had been caused by pieces of war that were still fighting battles inside my body. "Dr. Winters, what does this mean for treatment?"
It means we have a lot of work to do. Some of these fragments can be surgically removed, others are too risky to touch. But now that we know what we're dealing with, we can develop a real treatment plan instead of just managing symptoms. She printed out several copies of the scans and handed them to me. Cameron, I want you to understand something. The fact that you've been functioning at all with this much retained shrapnel is remarkable. Most people would have been completely disabled. The strength it's taken for you to keep going, to keep pushing through this level of chronic pain and neurological impairment, it's extraordinary. I looked down at the X-ray images in my hands, undeniable proof of what I'd been enduring for 3 years. Proof that I wasn't weak, wasn't faking, wasn't exaggerating. I was a warrior carrying the remnants of battle inside my own body. There's something else, Dr. Winters continued. I'm required to report this to the VA as a service-connected injury. Your disability rating will need to be reassessed, and you may be entitled to compensation for the years of inadequate treatment. The implications were staggering. Not just medical vindication, but official recognition that my suffering had been real and service-related. I drove home in a daze, the X-ray images on the passenger seat beside me like smoking guns in a criminal case. For 3 years, I'd been told that my pain was in my head. Now I had proof that it was literally in my body, dozens of pieces of foreign metal that had no business being there. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the scans and thinking about every family gathering where I'd been made to feel like a burden. Every time Austin had accused me of faking. Every moment when I doubted my own experience because the people I loved most had convinced me I couldn't trust my own body. The anger came in waves, not just at the military doctors who'd missed the shrapnel, but at my family who'd chosen to believe I was weak rather than wounded. At Austin, who'd appointed himself the expert on my condition without knowing the first thing about what I was actually enduring. But underneath that anger was something more powerful. Validation. For the first time in 3 years, I had proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't dramatic, wasn't seeking attention. I was injured, legitimately, and severely. And I had been all along. The question now was what to do with this information. I could keep it to myself, use it to get the medical treatment I needed, and continue avoiding family confrontations. That would be the easy path, the one that preserved everyone's comfort at the expense of my dignity. Or I could do what I'd been trained to do as an intelligence analyst. Present the evidence and let the facts speak for themselves. I decided to start with a phone call to my parents. Mom, I need you and Dad to come to Denver tomorrow. There's something important we need to discuss about my medical situation. Cameron, honey, we've talked about this. You can't keep obsessing over every little ache and pain. Maybe you should consider seeing a therapist instead of another doctor. Every little ache and pain. 3 years of agony reduced to hypochondriac behavior. Mom, this isn't about therapy. I have test results that change everything. Please, just trust me on this.
I could hear her talking to Dad in the background, the familiar tone of exasperation that had become their default response to any request from me. Fine, she said finally. But Cameron, this has to stop. You can't keep dragging the family through these medical dramas every few months. Medical dramas. That's what they called my desperate search for answers to explain why I could barely function. The next day, my parents arrived at my apartment looking like they were attending a funeral, which, in a way, they were. The funeral of their comfortable belief that their daughter was just being difficult. I'd prepared like I was giving an intelligence briefing, laying out the evidence in a logical sequence that would be impossible to dismiss or misinterpret. Before we start, I said, I need you both to understand that what I'm about to show you changes everything we thought we knew about my condition. Dad sighed heavily. Cameron, we've been through this. Dad, please, just look at the evidence before you make any judgments.
I handed them the first set of X-ray images. These are from a CT scan I had done yesterday. These white spots you see scattered throughout my body, they're shrapnel fragments, pieces of the mortar that nearly killed me in Afghanistan. They've been inside me for over 3 years. The room went silent. Mom held the X-ray up to the light, her face pale as she counted the dozens of fragments visible in just one image. There are more images, I continued, handing them the full set. Fragments in my chest, in my abdomen, in my skull near my brainstem. The chronic pain I've been experiencing, it's because pieces of metal have been pressing against nerves and creating inflammation. The headaches, they're shrapnel near my brain that's been causing pressure and affecting blood flow. Dad was staring at the skull X-ray with the focused attention he usually reserved for complex dental procedures. "How is this possible?" Mom whispered. "The military doctors said—" "The military doctors were wrong. They missed it. All of it. For 3 years, I've been walking around with a body full of war debris while everyone told me the pain was in my head." I pulled out Dr. Winter's written assessment and handed it to Dad. "This is from Dr. Rachel Winters, a specialist in combat-related injuries. She says the fact that I've been able to function at all with this much retained shrapnel is remarkable. Most people would have been completely disabled." Dad read the report twice, his expression changing from skepticism to shock, to something that might have been remorse. "Cameron, we didn't know," Mom said, her voice breaking. "If we had known—" "But you didn't want to know," I interrupted. "For 3 years, I've been telling you that something was seriously wrong. I described my symptoms in detail, showed you medical reports, begged you to understand that I was not making this up. And instead of believing me, you chose to believe that I was weak, dramatic, attention-seeking." The weight of 3 years of dismissed pain was finally finding its voice. Every time I had to cancel plans because of a migraine, you rolled your eyes. Every time I asked for help with something physical, you made comments about me being lazy. Every time I tried to explain why certain activities were impossible for me, you suggested I was making excuses. Mom was crying now, but I wasn't finished. "And Austin? Austin appointed himself the family expert on my condition. He told me I was faking it for attention. He said I was using mystery symptoms as a crutch. He accused me of playing the victim instead of taking responsibility for my own happiness." I pulled out the final piece of evidence, a letter from the VA acknowledging the service-connected nature of my injuries and outlining the compensation I was entitled to for years of inadequate treatment. "This is official recognition that my injuries are real, severe, and directly related to my military service. The VA is reassessing my disability rating based on these findings." Dad looked up from the documents with tears in his eyes. "Cameron, I'm so sorry. We should have believed you. We should have supported you instead of questioning you." "Yes, you should have. But the question now is what we do moving forward." I sat down across from them, feeling more in control than I had in years. "I'm going to need surgery to remove some of these fragments. Recovery will take months. Some of the damage might be permanent. And through all of this, I need to know that my family supports me instead of doubting me." Mom reached for my hand. "Of course we support you. We love you." "Love isn't enough anymore, Mom. I need respect. I need you to trust that I know my own body better than anyone else. I need you to stop treating my medical needs like inconveniences." They both nodded, but I could see the guilt and confusion in their faces. For 3 years, they'd been so certain that I was the problem. Now they had to confront the possibility that they had been part of the problem. But there was still one person who hadn't seen the evidence yet, one family member whose cruel words had cut the deepest, and who needed to understand exactly how wrong he had been. Austin was about to get an education in the difference between visible wounds and invisible ones, between faking injuries and carrying the literal fragments of war inside your body. The shrapnel x-rays that had vindicated me were about to humble the brother who thought he knew everything about my condition. And this time, when the evidence was presented, there would be no room for doubt, no space for denial, no way to maintain the comfortable fiction that his sister was just being dramatic. The truth has a way of silencing even the most confident critics, especially when that truth is written in metal fragments scattered throughout a warrior's body.
Austin thought he understood weakness and strength, real injuries and fake ones. The x-rays were about to teach him that sometimes the strongest people are the ones carrying invisible battles that would break anyone else. And sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to someone is doubt their pain when they're already fighting for their life against an enemy living inside their own body. Austin's voice on the phone was exactly what I expected, condescending and impatient, like I was interrupting something important with my latest medical drama. Cameron, Mom told me about your new doctor and your latest theory about mysterious shrapnel. Look, I get that you want answers, but at some point, you have to accept that maybe the problem isn't medical. Austin, stop talking, I said, my voice steady and calm in a way that surprised even me. I'm calling to invite you to dinner tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, my apartment. Dinner? Cam, I don't really have time for... Make time. There's something I need to show you, and this conversation needs to happen face to face. I could hear him sighing dramatically on the other end of the line. Fine, but I'm not sitting through another pity party about your mystery symptoms. Trust me, I said. This won't be a pity party. This will be an education. The next 24 hours were crucial. I had one chance to present the evidence in a way that would be impossible for Austin to dismiss, discount, or explain away. This wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about forcing him to confront the reality of what his words had done to me over the past 3 years. I spent the afternoon preparing like I was building a case for court. The X-ray images were organized chronologically, showing the progression from the initial field assessments that missed everything to the comprehensive scans that revealed the truth. Dr. Winter's medical reports were highlighted and annotated. The VA documentation acknowledging my service-connected injuries was printed and ready. But I also prepared emotionally. For 3 years, I'd absorbed Austin's criticism and doubt, internalized his suggestions that I was weak and attention-seeking. Tomorrow night, I would finally have the chance to show him exactly how wrong he'd been, not with emotional arguments or desperate pleas for understanding, but with cold, hard medical evidence. I chose my outfit carefully. Dark jeans and a simple gray sweater that didn't scream, "Look at me," but projected quiet confidence. I wanted Austin to focus on the evidence, not get distracted by any suggestion that I was being dramatic or attention-seeking. At exactly 7 o'clock, Austin knocked on my apartment door. He looked good, as always. Expensive suit from his financial services job, perfectly styled hair, the kind of polished appearance that had always made me feel shabby by comparison. But tonight, for the first time in years, I didn't feel intimidated by his success or his confidence. I had something he'd never had, the truth. So, he said, settling into my couch with the casual arrogance that had always irritated me. What's this big revelation you needed to share? Another doctor who thinks your problems are more special than everyone else's? I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I sat down across from him and pulled out a manila folder. Austin, before I show you what's in this folder, I want you to think back to every conversation we've had about my health over the past 3 years. Every time you've suggested I was faking, exaggerating, or seeking attention. Every time you've dismissed my pain as psychological weakness. He rolled his eyes. Cam, we've been through this. I'm not asking you to apologize yet. I'm asking you to remember what you've said and how certain you were when you said it. I opened the folder and pulled out the first X-ray image. A CT scan taken 5 days ago. Those white spots are metallic foreign objects embedded in my body. Shrapnel fragments from the mortar attack in Afghanistan that have been inside me for over 3 years.
Austin glanced at the image dismissively. Cam, I'm not a doctor. I can't interpret. You don't need to be a doctor to count, I interrupted, handing him a magnifying glass. Count the fragments in just this one image. He took the magnifying glass reluctantly and held it over the X-ray. I watched his expression change as he began to see the scope of what was scattered throughout my torso. There are dozens of them, he said quietly. 47 fragments in my chest and abdomen alone. Would you like to see the skull images? I handed him the cranial X-ray before he could answer. This one was even more dramatic. Multiple fragments near my brainstem, with one particularly large piece clearly visible pressing against nerve clusters. Austin stared at the image for a long moment, his confident demeanor beginning to crack. The larger fragment here, I continued, pointing to the obvious piece near my brain, has been creating pressure that explains the chronic headaches you've watched me suffer through, the ones you said were probably stress-related or attention-seeking behavior. I pulled out the next set of images, detailed scans showing fragments embedded in muscle tissue, pressing against nerves, creating the inflammation that had been causing my chronic pain. This fragment in my left side has been pressing against a major nerve cluster for 3 years. It's the source of the pain that made it difficult for me to lift grocery bags, move furniture, or participate in family activities. The pain, you said, was probably psychosomatic. Austin was quiet now, studying each image with the focused attention he usually reserved for financial reports. How is this possible? He asked. The military doctors said. The military doctors were working under combat conditions with limited equipment. These fragments are small, some smaller than grains of rice. They wouldn't have been visible on the basic X-rays available in a field hospital. I handed him Dr. Winter's comprehensive medical report.
This is from Dr. Rachel Winters, a specialist in combat-related injuries. She says, and I quote, "The patient has demonstrated remarkable resilience in maintaining basic functionality despite extensive retained foreign objects that would have rendered most individuals completely disabled." Austin read the report carefully, and I watched as his face changed as the implications sank in. "Cameron, I didn't know." "But you were certain anyway," I interrupted. "You were so confident in your assessment of my condition, so sure that you understood my symptoms better than I did, that you felt comfortable accusing me of faking injuries for attention." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the voice recording I'd made earlier. "I want to play something for you. This is what you said to me at Tyler's birthday party 6 months ago." I pressed play, and Austin's voice filled the room. "You're faking it for attention, just like you always do. There's nothing wrong with you that a little tough love won't fix." The sound of his own words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes and shook his head slowly. "And this," I continued, scrolling to another recording, "is what you said in the grocery store parking lot. Face it, Cam, you're using these mystery symptoms as a crutch. At some point, you have to stop playing the victim and take responsibility for your own happiness." I paused the recording and looked directly at him. "Mystery symptoms, Austin. That's what you called pieces of war embedded in my brain and organs." He was silent for a long moment, staring at the X-ray images spread across my coffee table. "Cameron, I'm sorry. I was wrong. You should have believed me," I said firmly. "For 3 years, I told you exactly what I was experiencing. I described my symptoms in detail. I explained how the pain affected my daily life, my ability to work, my capacity to participate in family activities. And instead of supporting me, you appointed yourself the family expert on my condition and decided that I was weak, dramatic, and dishonest." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where he'd delivered that cruel assessment 6 months earlier. "Do you know what it's like to be in constant pain while the people you love most tell you it's all in your head? Do you know what it does to your sense of reality when your own brother suggests you're faking a combat injury for attention?" Austin was staring at his hands now, his usual confidence completely gone. I started doubting myself.
After that birthday party, after your accusations, I began wondering if maybe I was exaggerating my symptoms. Maybe I was seeking attention. Maybe the pain really was psychological. I turned back to face him. I pushed myself harder, ignored warning signs, tried to prove to you that I wasn't weak by forcing myself through activities that made my symptoms worse. Do you know what happened? I ended up in the emergency room twice because I was trying so hard to prove I wasn't faking that I pushed my body beyond its limits. The weight of what I was saying seemed to settle over Austin like a heavy blanket. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the evidence spread out before him. "There's more," I said, pulling out the final set of documents. "The VA has officially recognized my injuries as service-connected and severe. They're reassessing my disability rating and providing compensation for years of inadequate treatment." I handed him the letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. "This is official acknowledgement that not only were my injuries real and severe, but that I've been undercompensated and undertreated for years. The government recognizes what my own family refused to see." Austin read the letter slowly, and when he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Cameron, I don't know what to say. I was completely wrong about everything." "Yes, you were. The question is what you're going to do about it." He looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sorry isn't enough, Austin. For 3 years, you've been the loudest voice in our family questioning my integrity, my character, my honesty about my own body. Your opinions influenced how Mom and Dad treated me, how they viewed my medical needs, how they responded to my requests for support." I sat back down and faced him directly. "You have a choice to make. You can acknowledge publicly what you've learned tonight, admit to the family that your assessment of my condition was wrong, and commit to supporting me through the surgeries and recovery I'm going to need. Or you can try to minimize this, make excuses for your behavior, and pretend that this conversation changes nothing." Austin was quiet for a long moment, processing the ultimatum I'd just presented. "What kind of surgeries?" he asked quietly. "Multiple procedures, to remove the fragments that can be safely extracted. Some are too close to vital organs and nerves to remove, so I'll be dealing with chronic pain management for the rest of my life. Recovery from each surgery will take weeks or months." I pulled out the surgical timeline Dr. Winters had prepared. "The first surgery is scheduled for next month, removal of the fragment pressing against my brainstem. It's the most dangerous procedure because of the location, but it's also the one most likely to provide relief from the chronic headaches." Austin studied the surgical plan with growing understanding of what I was facing. "Cameron, of course I'll support you, whatever you need. I need more than your private support. I need you to acknowledge publicly, to our entire family, that your assessment of my condition was wrong. I need you to explain to everyone who heard you dismiss my injuries that you misunderstood the situation completely." He nodded slowly. "I can do that. I should do that."
And I need you to understand that this changes our relationship permanently. I can forgive you for being wrong about my medical condition. That happens. But I can't forget the cruelty with which you delivered your opinions, the confidence you had while dismissing my pain, the way you made me doubt my own experience of my own body. Austin's face crumpled slightly. "Cameron, I never meant... Intent doesn't matter when the impact is that devastating. For 3 years, every time I was in pain, I heard your voice telling me I was faking it. Every time I had to miss an event or ask for help, I remembered your accusations about seeking attention. Your words became part of my internal dialogue, making every symptom feel like something I had to prove, rather than something I was experiencing." I gathered the X-ray images and medical reports, organizing them back into the folder like closing a case file. "Moving forward, you don't get to have opinions about my medical condition unless you're asked for them. You don't get to suggest treatments, question symptoms, or offer assessments of my progress. You lost that privilege when you chose cruelty over compassion." Austin was crying now, quiet tears that he didn't bother to wipe away. "I understand,"
he said. And Cameron, for what it's worth, I'm not just sorry for being wrong about your injuries. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, the things I said, the assumptions I made. You deserved better from me, especially after everything you've sacrificed for our country. It was the most genuine apology he'd ever given me, but it couldn't undo 3 years of damage. Thank you for saying that. It matters, even if it doesn't fix everything. He looked at the X-ray images and medical reports. Can I ask you something? What made you decide to share this with me tonight? You could have just gotten the treatment you need without ever telling the family about the shrapnel. I considered the question carefully. Because living with invisible injuries is hard enough without also carrying the weight of other people's disbelief. I spent 3 years doubting myself because the people I loved most told me my pain wasn't real. That doubt almost destroyed me. I paused, thinking about all the veterans who were probably facing similar battles with families who didn't understand invisible wounds. But also because you needed to learn this lesson. Not just for my sake, but for anyone else you might encounter who's dealing with invisible injuries, chronic pain, or conditions that don't show up in obvious ways. Your assumptions about what makes someone strong or weak, what constitutes real versus fake suffering, those assumptions are dangerous. Austin nodded, absorbing the larger implications of what I was saying. You're right. I made judgments about things I didn't understand, and I was cruel in the way I expressed those judgments. The cruelty is what made it unforgivable, Austin. You weren't just wrong, you were confidently, aggressively wrong. You turned my medical condition into a character assessment, my pain into a moral failing. I stood up, signaling that our conversation was nearing its end. I have one more request. I want you to call Mom and Dad tonight and tell them what you've learned. I want you to explain to them that your previous assessments of my condition were not only wrong, but harmfully wrong. And I want you to commit in front of them to supporting me through the upcoming surgeries and recovery. Austin wiped his eyes and nodded. I'll call them as soon as I get home. Good, because tomorrow I'm meeting with Dr. Winters to finalize the surgical schedule, and I want to know that my family is united in supporting me instead of questioning me. As Austin gathered his jacket and prepared to leave, he turned back one more time. Cameron, can I ask you how you've forgiven Mom and Dad so easily when you're having such a hard time forgiving me? The question caught me off guard, but I knew the answer immediately. Because they doubted me, but they weren't cruel about it. They questioned my symptoms, but they didn't attack my character. They were wrong, but they weren't deliberately hurtful in the way you were. I opened the door for him. Mom and Dad treated my condition like a medical mystery they didn't understand. You treated it like a character flaw I was choosing. There's a difference between ignorance and cruelty, Austin. One is forgivable with education. The other requires earning forgiveness through changed behavior over time. After Austin left, I sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the medical evidence that had vindicated 3 years of suffering. The X-ray images were spread across my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle that had finally been solved. But more than vindication, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity about my own worth and my right to be believed when I spoke about my own experience. The shrapnel that had been hidden in my body for 3 years had taught me something important about invisible battles. Just because other people can't see your wounds doesn't mean they're not real. Just because your pain doesn't show up in conventional ways doesn't mean it's not legitimate. And just because someone you love dismisses your suffering doesn't mean you have to accept their assessment of your reality. My phone rang an hour later. It was Mom. Cameron, Austin just called us. He told us about the X-rays, about the shrapnel. Honey, we had no idea how wrong we've been. I know, Mom. Austin and I had a long conversation about it. He's devastated. He said he was cruel to you, that he made you doubt yourself when you were already suffering so much. I could hear the guilt in her voice, the recognition that the whole family had failed me in different ways. Mom, we're going to get through this. The surgeries, the recovery, all of it. But I need you to understand how much your doubt hurt me, even if it wasn't intended to be cruel.
We understand, sweetheart, and we're going to do better. We're going to support you the way we should have been supporting you all along. That night, I fell asleep holding one of the X-ray images, not out of anger or resentment, but out of gratitude. Gratitude that the truth had finally been discovered, that the invisible had become visible, that the battles I've been fighting alone were now acknowledged and validated. The shrapnel that had nearly killed me in Afghanistan had also nearly destroyed my relationships with the people I loved most. But in the end, it became the evidence that saved both my health and my sense of reality. Sometimes the things that wound us deepest are also the things that ultimately heal us, not because the pain was necessary, but because surviving it proves to ourselves and others just how strong we really are. Austin thought he understood strength and weakness, real injuries and imagined ones. The shrapnel X-rays had taught him that sometimes the strongest people are the ones carrying battles inside their bodies that would break anyone else. And sometimes the most important victory isn't over an external enemy, but over the doubt that others plant in your mind about your own experience of pain and survival. The fragments of war that had been silently destroying me for 3 years had finally found their voice, and in speaking their truth, they had given me back mine. The first surgery was scheduled for November 15th, exactly 1 month after the confrontation that changed everything. Dr. Winters had explained that the fragment near my brainstem was the highest priority. It was causing the most dangerous symptoms and had the potential to create permanent neurological damage if left untreated. But it was also the riskiest procedure. Operating that close to the brainstem meant that even the smallest mistake could result in paralysis, loss of cognitive function, or death. I won't lie to you, Cameron, Dr. Winters had said during our pre-surgical consultation. This is delicate work, but leaving that fragment where it is isn't an option. It's already causing significant pressure, and the inflammation around it is getting worse. The weeks leading up to the surgery were different from anything I'd experienced since coming home from Afghanistan. For the first time in 3 years, my family rallied around me with genuine support instead of skepticism. Austin had kept his promise. He'd called our parents the night of our confrontation and laid out everything he'd learned about my condition. According to Mom, he didn't minimize his mistakes or make excuses for his behavior. He acknowledged that he'd been not just wrong, but cruel in his wrongness. More importantly, he'd volunteered to be my primary caregiver during recovery, taking extended leave from his job to ensure I had the support I needed. The night before surgery, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid of dying, I'd made peace with that possibility during my deployments, but because I was afraid of surviving as something less than myself. Austin drove me to Denver General at dawn, and for 6 hours, he waited while Dr. Winters and her surgical team worked to remove the fragment that had been pressing against my brainstem for 3 years. I woke up in the ICU with something I hadn't experienced since before the attack: silence in my head. The constant pressure, the background noise of pain that had become so familiar, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to think clearly. It was gone. The surgery went perfectly, Dr. Winters told me later. We removed the fragment and most of the inflammatory tissue around it. Your brain should start functioning more normally as you heal. Recovery was a revelation. As the surgical swelling subsided, I began to understand how much the hidden shrapnel had stolen from me. It wasn't just the obvious symptoms, the headaches, the pain, the cognitive fog. It was the subtle ways that constant neurological irritation had affected my personality, my energy, my ability to engage with the world. For the first time in 3 years, I could read a book without triggering a migraine. I could have conversations without feeling mentally exhausted afterward. I could make decisions without the background haze of pain influencing every choice. Austin was there through all of it. The difficult first weeks when surgical pain replaced the chronic pain I'd grown accustomed to,
the physical therapy sessions to restore my balance and coordination, the emotional work of adjusting to life without the constant battle against my own body. But more than just practical support, he provided something I hadn't realized I'd lost: faith in my own perceptions. For 3 years, his doubt had made me doubt myself. Now his unwavering support helped me trust my own experience of pain and survival again. 2 months after the first surgery, we returned to Dr. Winter's office for a comprehensive evaluation. The results were beyond anything we had hoped for. The neurological symptoms that had dominated my life were virtually gone. My cognitive function tests showed dramatic improvement. Even my chronic pain levels had decreased significantly as the inflammation throughout my system began to calm down. "This is remarkable progress," Dr. Winter said, reviewing the latest scans. "Your brain has essentially rewired itself now that it's not under constant pressure. We're seeing improved blood flow, reduced inflammation, and normalization of the areas that were most affected." But she also had more news. The success of the first surgery had revealed additional fragments that needed attention. The removal of the brainstem fragment had improved the quality of the imaging, allowing them to identify smaller pieces that had been obscured before. "We can remove most of the remaining fragments in a series of less invasive procedures. None of them will be as dangerous as the first surgery, but addressing them will give you the best chance at full recovery." Over the next 8 months, I underwent 4 more surgeries. Each one removed pieces of Afghanistan that had been living in my body, and each one brought me closer to the person I'd been before that mortar round changed everything. But the physical healing was only part of the transformation.
The process had taught me something profound about the nature of invisible injuries and the importance of being believed when you speak about your own experience. I'd spent 3 years having my reality questioned by the people who should have supported me most, and that doubt had become almost as damaging as the shrapnel itself. Now, with undeniable medical proof of what I'd been enduring, I felt a responsibility to use my experience to help other veterans who might be facing similar battles with invisible wounds and unsupportive families. I started volunteering with the Colorado Veterans Support Network, specifically working with veterans who were struggling with family relationships affected by combat injuries. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. Many of the veterans I worked with had stories that echoed mine: families who couldn't understand invisible injuries, relatives who questioned the legitimacy of psychological trauma, spouses who grew impatient with the long process of healing from wounds that couldn't be seen. The thing that saved me, I would tell them, wasn't just getting the right medical diagnosis. It was learning to trust my own experience, even when other people doubted it. Your pain is real, regardless of whether other people understand it. I also became involved with advocacy work, pushing for better protocols in military medicine to catch retained foreign objects before service members were discharged. My case had revealed significant gaps in the screening processes that allowed dozens of fragments to go undetected for years. Working with Dr. Winters, I helped develop new imaging protocols for blast injury victims, designed to catch the kinds of microscopic fragments that had been missed in my initial treatment. The work felt like giving meaning to the suffering I'd endured, transforming my experience into something that could prevent other veterans from facing the same prolonged battle for diagnosis and treatment. Austin became one of my strongest advocates in this work. His transformation from skeptic to supporter gave him unique credibility when speaking to other family members who were struggling to understand their loved ones' invisible injuries. I was that family member who thought I knew better than my sister about her own body. I was confident in my ignorance and cruel in my certainty. Learning the truth didn't just change my understanding of Cameron's condition, it changed my understanding of what it means to support someone through trauma. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes publicly and educate others about the harm that doubt can cause became a powerful tool in our advocacy work. Veterans would bring their skeptical family members to meetings specifically to hear from someone who had learned the hard way about the difference between visible and invisible wounds. 1 year after my final surgery, I received a call from the Department of Veterans Affairs.
My case had been selected for a comprehensive review that would be used to improve screening protocols for other veterans with similar injuries. Ms. Reed, your case has highlighted serious gaps in our diagnostic processes. The fact that you lived with this much retained shrapnel for 3 years without proper diagnosis is unacceptable. We want to use your experience to ensure this doesn't happen to other veterans. The review process was intensive, involving multiple medical experts, policy analysts, and military officials. But it resulted in new mandatory screening requirements for all veterans who had been exposed to explosive devices, regardless of whether they showed obvious symptoms at the time of discharge. 6 months later, I received another call that meant even more to me personally. It was from a veteran in Texas whose new screening had revealed retained fragments that would have gone undetected under the old protocols. They found shrapnel I'd been carrying for 5 years, she told me. The doctor said if it had gone much longer, I could have had a stroke or permanent brain damage. Your case literally saved my life. That's when I understood the real purpose of everything I had been through. The 3 years of pain, the family conflict, the battle for diagnosis and treatment, all of it had led to changes that would help other veterans avoid the same prolonged suffering. But the most important transformation was in my relationship with my family, particularly with Austin. The process of confronting the truth about my injuries had forced all of us to examine our assumptions about strength, weakness, and what it means to support someone through invisible battles. Austin and I developed a relationship built on honesty rather than the complicated dynamics of our childhood. He no longer tried to fix my problems or offer unsolicited advice about my medical care. Instead, he listened when I needed to talk and provided practical support when I asked for it. More importantly, he'd learned to recognize the difference between helping and controlling, between supporting and patronizing. The arrogance that had once made him so confident in his misguided assessments had been replaced by humility and genuine respect for my expertise about my own experience. Our parents, too, had evolved in their understanding of what support looked like. They stopped trying to manage my medical decisions or offer alternative explanations for my symptoms. They learned to trust that I was the expert on my own body and that their role was to provide emotional support, not medical opinions. 2 years after the final surgery, I moved back to Colorado Springs and took a position with the VA medical system, working as a patient advocate specifically for veterans with complex diagnoses. The work allowed me to use both my military experience and my personal journey through the medical system to help other veterans navigate similar challenges. The most profound victory wasn't over the shrapnel itself, but over the doubt that others had planted in my mind about my own reality. Learning to trust myself again, to believe my own experience regardless of external validation, to speak my truth even when others questioned it, that was the real healing.
And when veterans call me now, struggling with invisible wounds and unsupportive families, I tell them what I wish someone had told me 3 years ago. Your pain doesn't have to be visible to be real. Your wounds don't have to be obvious to be valid. Your experience doesn't have to be understood by others to be true. Sometimes the most radical act of self-care is simply believing yourself when you say you're in pain, regardless of who thinks you're being dramatic. Sometimes the greatest strength is trusting your own voice when everyone else is telling you to be quiet. The shrapnel that was meant to silence me ultimately gave me the most powerful voice I've ever had. The voice of someone who survived not just the obvious wounds of war, but the invisible wounds of having her reality questioned by the people who should have supported her most. That voice now speaks for every veteran carrying hidden battles, every person whose pain has been dismissed as imaginary, every survivor who's been told they're being dramatic when they're actually being remarkably strong. The fragments are gone, but the lessons they taught me will last forever. And sometimes that makes all the pain worth it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen.
If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.